Welcome back. All right. Just wanted, while you were gone, the handout for the next paper has been distributed in the link. It will also be on your screen. But if you look in the chat, there is a link to the PDF, so you can get a copy of it yourself. So our next speaker is Russ Friedman from the KU Leuven, and he'll be speaking on making sense of Aquinas, Peter Auriol on prime matter, pure potency, and existence. Professor Friedman.
Thank you very much, Bill. And thank you, Nicola, for having arranged all of these wonderful meetings. And thanks to all the people who have participated. I'm looking forward to continuing to participate because I'm learning a whole lot. So I was looking for some way to get Auriol in here. Peter Auriol, he's my favorite guy, and I got it because of Jeff Brouwer, and so Jeff Brouwer is going to take a prominent place in this, and that's where the making sense of Aquinas, because Jeff got a whole lot of flack last time about Aquinas's view of the ontology of prime matter, and I think that whatever you think about Aquinas's view of ontology of prime matter, you can make a good case that Auriol said it the way that Jeff would have liked Aquinas to have said it. Let's put it that way. So there's a handout. I'll share my screen, or I am sharing my screen, and I'll keep up with the handout on there. I'm sorry that the quotations from Auriol don't have any references, but it's from a working edition that I'm working on of that text, and I'll try and update it and give you better citations later on. So my title is deliberately provocative. That's to say, it's misleading. The two main figures to appear in the paper I'm about to read are indeed Thomas Aquinas and Peter Auriol. And for those of you who don't know them, they're on number 1 in your handout. But I won't be using Aquinas as anything more than an extremely clear case of one issue discussed in later medieval theories of prime matter. Namely, this is 2 on your handout, how much actuality and existence does prime matter need to have in its own right in order to serve the kinds of theoretical purposes most, if not all, medieval authors thought prime matter needed to serve? Another way of putting this is, and this is 3 on your handout, most medieval authors thought prime matter is pure potency. Well, what does that claim entail for prime matter's actuality and especially its existence? Now, this topic was raised already in connection with Aquinas in the last edition of The Elusive Substrate on November 5th, when Jeff Brouwer gave us a super clear paper on his view about Aquinas on prime matter as pure potentiality. In my paper today, I'm going to be using Jeff's presentation as one point of departure, since Aquinas makes really clear, I think, the kinds of constraints or pressures that any theory of prime matter needs to contend with. When I've given enough background in Aquinas to get the issue motivated, then I want to show how Peter Auriol deals with it. The French Franciscan, who died in 1322, is best known as a conceptualist forerunner of William of Ockham. Auriol comes up with a theory of prime matter that in many respects reminds of Thomas Aquinas's. When Auriol says that prime matter is pure potency, well, he really means it. And he doesn't countenance any talk of matter being actual or having actuality, no matter how that's understood, pardon the pun. But, and here's what I come back to my deliberately provocative and somewhat misleading title. I'm not going to be demonstrating strong historical links in which Auriol read and interpreted Aquinas. Rather, I want to suggest that Auriol's way of circumnavigating those constraints and pressures when it comes to matter theory is a way that Aquinas might possibly also have followed. In other words, holding the same sort of notion of prime matter and responding to the same sorts of theoretical pressures in that connection, Auriol can perhaps be seen as making explicit what is less clear in Aquinas. That's what I mean when I write, making Aquinas make sense. So this is what I'm going to do. After introducing the problem of matter's pure potency in Aquinas, using as my pedagogical tool a duel between Bob Pasnow and Jeff Brouwer, I'll move on to Auriol and his theory of prime matter, and how it, in my view, elegantly captures what we might have wished Aquinas had said. And I'll be telling you a bunch about Auriol's hylomorphism in the process. Now, it goes without saying that there's a huge amount of secondary literature on Aquinas on prime matter as pure potency, But the best way I can think of to get across what I want to say about Aquinas is through a showdown between two of our dear colleagues. In the left corner, hailing from the University of Colorado, Boulder, is none other than Robert Pasnow. And in the right corner, from Purdue University in Indiana, please welcome our very own Jeffrey Brower. Pasnow and Brower have taken two rather different views on how to understand Aquinas on prime matter. Pasnow, a reductionist or even a limitativist view. Brower, as we heard in the last session of the elusive substrate, has a more robust view of prime matter's existence. I don't need and I won't try to adjudicate between them. In fact, all I want to do is motivate the following claim. You can interpret Aquinas in different ways. And possibly the reason for that is because Aquinas didn't express himself clearly enough, or maybe hadn't thought entirely through his view on the ontology of prime matter. So first Pasnow, then Brower. Here's a quotation, this is at 4 on your handout, from Pasnow's award-winning book, Thomas Aquinas on Human Nature. This is what Pasnow writes: prime matter is therefore, for Aquinas, just a logical abstraction, asymptotic to the curve of being. It's a conceptual part of material objects, a part we can identify only as that which would be left if, per impossibile, all actuality was stripped away. In a sense, then, Aquinas' theory of matter is eliminative. His talk of prime matter doesn't introduce some primitive, mysterious stuff. It does just the opposite, because it entails the complete rejection of matter as any kind of stuff having independent ontological status. These suggestions are highly unorthodox. Aquinas regularly talks as if prime material substances are composed of matter and form, and he regularly speaks as if prime matter is a kind of substrate. But it seems to me that such talk cannot be taken literally. Now, Pasnow admits himself that the case for his account is not primarily textual, but rather has to do with the whole tenor of Aquinas' metaphysics, as Robert Pasnow has reconstructed it, in which actuality is theoretically primitive in such a way and to such an extent that a pure potency, which is what Aquinas says prime matter is basically eliminated as a genuine item in the world. For Pasnow, at least in 2002, in Aquinas' world, there can't exist anything with no actuality at all, since actuality is the basic marker of existence in the first place. So a pure potency, like prime matter, falls outside of the realm of existence. Now, Pasnow, in his 2011 Colossus, Metaphysical Themes, this is 5 on your handout, tempers his view, but nevertheless, he still writes, and this is in bold on your handout, I'm still inclined to endorse, or at any rate not ready to give up, his proposal concerning the ontological elimination of prime matter in Aquinas' philosophy. So what does Jeff have to say? Well, I'm going to be extremely rude, and I'm going to quote from an email that he sent me on the 6th of November. This is 6 on your handout. Sorry, Jeff. That Jeff wrote to me after his the elusive substrate talk last month and expresses his view extremely succinctly and clearly. Here comes Jeff. Everything Aquinas says about identifying prime matter with pure potentiality in the context of change or natural philosophy fits perfectly well with the view that prime matter is an enduring substrate whose identity and existence is independent of any particular form, but not of forms in general. That is to say, God could create prime matter apart from any particular form, but not apart from some form or another. That's about as clear a statement as you can ask for, I think. Prime matter exists in virtue of existing under some form or another, while it nevertheless has some existence of its own. Prime matter cannot exist without form, that's strictly impossible, but it has an incomplete existence that is brought to actuality through form. And Jeff gave us a slew of passages from Aquinas' natural philosophy that do indeed point in that direction. Moreover, he stressed on 7 on your handout, the argument from substantial change. I won't go into it, but substantial change requires a substrate, prime matter, that has some existence of its own. Just an aside here, Bob Pasnow at least signed his name to exactly this argument in number 8 here in the Philosophy of Aquinas. Pasnow and Shields write that the argument from change show exactly what Jeff says it shows. So whether maybe Chris Shields forced Bob Pasnow to sign his name to this, but yeah, this is a mystery. I wish Pasnow were here. We could ask him, but or maybe Jeff knows. He can tell us maybe later. But what we have are two widely diverging views of Aquinas on the ontology of prime matter. Prime matter has no existence, it has no actuality, that's Pasnow, versus prime matter has the kind of existence that is only actual when under some form or another. That's Brouwer. The thing is, I can sort of see both of these views. If you look at number 9 on your handout, this is a quotation from Aquinas's De Principiis Naturae. What's in potency to substantial being is properly called matter. Matter has being from that which comes to it, because of itself it has incomplete being. Thus, speaking without qualification, formed is being to matter. If I look at the bolded text, I say Jeff's right. If I look at the italics text, I say that Bob's right. It's kind of up and down. I assume that Jeff can say, well, you can just interpret it because it just comes right after the passage that quotes mine, that supports my view. But there's perhaps a lack of precision there that opens up for people interpreting Aquinas in the way that Bob Pasnow and many, many, many other figures have in the history of philosophy. Now, in 10, 11, and 12, I've given you some quotations from Aquinas that I'm not going to talk about, but I'm happy to talk about afterwards. Quotations that I think that Pasnow would say, these are from Aquinas's broader metaphysics and show that there is a type of convertibility, a one-to-one tracking between existence and actuality. And I think that Aquinas has some of this. Whether it applies to prime matter or not, I don't know. But I think that especially number 12, you can argue that Aquinas is saying existence tracks actuality, and anything that has actuality has existence, and vice versa. So this is one thing to worry about with Aquinas, even if he's consistent, as Jeff says he is, in his natural philosophy. Okay, with that, I would like to move on to Peter Auriol. This is now at 13 on your handout. So in Auriol's major treatment of hylomorphism, this is 13, his commentary on the second book of the sentences, Distinction 12, it's a sprawling text of around 27,000 words that had their proximate origins in Auriol's lectures on the sentences at Paris in the 1317 to 1318 academic year. Although, as Bill Duba has shown, and this would be what, number 3, the third article listed under 14 on your handout, as Bill Duba has showed, the remote origin of Auriol's doctrine goes back to the earliest work we know from him, his De Principiis Naturae, from around 1314 in Bologna. The very first quaestio, so investigative unit, that Auriol asks in his treatment of hylomorphism, and this is 15 on your handout, asks whether prime matter's essence, in its own right, ex se, lacks any type of actuality without qualification. He raises the question, he tells us, on account of the varied opinions of diverse doctors. He gives 3 opinions, but of those, only the third is relevant for us now. And this view, Auriol describes as following the mind of Aristotle and his commentator. This will be Auriol's own view. And it's worth mentioning here that an important aspect of Auriol's theory of the ontology of prime matter is that he claims it is exactly what Aristotle and Averroes thought about the ontology of prime matter. Auriol giving dozens of quotations from these 2 authors, and less frequently Augustine. Bill Duba has written extensively on this aspect. Again, this is 14. Look at any of those articles and you'll see it. And the aspect also appears more diffusely in the other major studies of Auriol's hylomorphism, specifically those by Bob Pasnow and by Antonio Petagine. They're on 16 on your handout. So what is the view that Auriol thinks Aristotle and Averroes supported? Auriol writes, this is 17 on your handout, Aristotle and Averroes say that matter's essence is not form's essence. Nevertheless, matter has a sort of essence that lacks any essential actuality, such that intrinsically, beneath its own nature, It has utterly no actuality, but is purely actualizable and purely modifiable thing, res. Nor on this basis is matter nothing, since nothing is neither actuality nor actualizable. End quote. Here's the crux of it for Auriol. Prime matter has an essence, it has a nature that is wholly different from form, and hence prime matter, is something. Auriol even goes so far in that quotation as to call it a thing, a res. But it's a kind of res that has no actuality of its own. It is rather completely actualizable. In order to unpack this, we need to see what Auriol means by the term actuality. And now we're going to get back to some of the things that Sylvia was bringing up in her excellent paper. And indeed, defining actuality is Auriol's first order of business. What is it that we mean by the word actuality when we ask whether prime matter has any actuality or whether matter's essence lacks all actuality? If, and this is 18 on your handout, by actuality you mean a positive nature, ratio, then there's no genuine question here, according to Auriol. Matter is no mere negation, it's not nothing, and hence it is a positive nature. If, this is 19, by actuality you mean entity, then again, Auriol says there's no real question. As he's already told us, matter isn't nothing. So by the same token, it's an entity. It's only in the third way of taking the term actuality that one can genuinely ask whether prime matter has any actuality. And this is what Auriol says. This is 20 on your handout with the bold text in the Latin. By accepting actuality in a third way for termination and essential distinction, in this way, actuality and being an entity that is not nothing are not the same, nor are they convertible with one another. End quote. This is the only meaning of actuality, according to Auriol, on which the answer to the question of prime matter's actuality is in any way in doubt. The main point he's making here is that existence and actuality, on this understanding of the term actuality, are not convertible. They're not coextensive, and an existent with no actuality is not a contradiction. That's the main point. Something can exist with no actuality at all. Rather, something with no actuality at all can exist. That's better. As a way of showing what he's driving at, Auriol notes, and this is 21 on your handout, Auriol notes that all the parts in a continuum are entities and are not nothing. And nevertheless, they do not exist by their own actuality, but all are there in potency and have their being by a single actuality. That is to say, the actuality of the whole, because they lack their own actuality and distinction. For one point is not divided and separated from the other. We come back to separability. Division and separation, that's what's at issue for Auriol when it comes to actuality. What is actual is what is separately existing. What is merely potential is not separately existing, and nevertheless, what is potential does indeed exist. The example of the continuum is nicely illustrative. The parts of the continuum are really there, they exist, and yet they don't exist on their own, but rather merely potentially, since they exist as a part of something else, the whole, the continuum that it's a part of. As long as they remain parts of a continuum, the parts get their actuality from the whole of which they are parts. Parts that, for all that they exist and are entities, are nonetheless in potency. This is actuality as a way of talking about an item's ability to stand on its own 2 feet, metaphorically speaking. If it can exist in its own right, then it's actual. If, on the other hand, it's in a state of dependency on something else for its actual existence, then it's in potency. Prime matter for Auriol is pure potency on these terms, and he calls it, and we'll see in a couple of minutes in 22 on your handout, he calls it pure potential. Now, Auriol ties this notion of actuality back to a specific passage from Aristotle. This is 21 with the Latin underlined on 20 in your handout. So in Metaphysics, Book Zeta, and I apologize, I should have given this as chapter 13 at Becker number 1039A7. In Book Zeta 7, where Aristotle, dealing with universals, mentions that substances cannot be composed of other actually distinct substances. And Aristotle draws an analogy. A double line can be composed of two half lines, but only potentially, since, and I quote, their actuality separates them. Auriol paraphrases this by saying that, and this is 21 on your handout again, the underlined Latin in 20, actuality is what separates and distinguishes. This is Auriol's governing understanding of actuality in his discussion of prime matter. So, potency, conversely, is a state of being had by an item that is not separated and distinguished. So what is prime matter? How is it best characterized? Here's a nice attempt by Auriol to explain his vision. This is 22 on your handout. Prime matter is an entity lacking any actuality and termination and distinction, but is pure potential. That is, it's pure actualizable. That can be dragged to any actuality and distinct being. And consequently, it is every nature able to be generated and corrupted. It is every nature able to be generated and corrupted, in which all things able to be generated meet, they convene there, but only with the determination removed. And still with the determination arriving, prime matter is appropriated so that it is that nature. For with the arrival of the form of a stone, which is nothing other than the determination of the stone, this prime matter becomes the stone. End quote. Prime matter lacks all actuality. It's pure potency because it has no determination or definition on its own. It's able to be any material thing, and that's why it's pure potency. But it gets determination and definition exclusively from a substantial form. And this happens through substantial form dragging it or appropriating prime matter to the relevant determination. More precisely put, Auriol thinks that the substantial form is the determination that of itself drags the prime matter to what it should be. Prime matter is what is determinable, substantial form what determines. For our purposes, there are two main elements to Auriol's theory, and this is 23 on your handout. First, prime matter is not nothing. It has its own existence in reality. Second, prime matter is incomplete or indeterminate, needing for its determination a substantial form and being unable to exist in actuality without substantial form. This is just to say that for Auriol, prime matter lacks all actuality and is pure potency. Now, with regard to the first of these elements, that prime matter is not nothing, but has an entity, Auriol stresses time and time again that prime matter is not nothing. Now, we saw in a quotation above, 17, where Auriol tells us that just because matter is strictly the ability or capacity to be actualized, and hence has no actuality of its own, that does not mean that matter is nothing, since, I quote, nothing is neither actual nor actualizable, end quote. Anything that is genuinely able to be actualized must have some existence of its own. And as mentioned before, Auriol is even willing to call prime matter a thing, a res, and a reality, a realitas, and an entity, entitas. Auriol tells us that, this is 24 on your handout, prime matter is every nature indeterminately and non-determinately, and it is not nothing, because nothing is neither determinately nor indeterminately a nature. He adds, 25 in your handout, what is nothing is not something that can be purely dragged towards towards act, nor is it the nature of every generable thing in potency. In short, Auriol makes it absolutely clear that prime matter is an item in the world with its own existence and even nature, albeit a totally indeterminate nature. Finally, and this perhaps amounts to the same point, Auriol is clear that prime matter is not just cooked up by the intellect, writing, and this is 26 on your handout, matter is a thing, a res, outside the intellect, other than the substantial form and the composite, such that its indetermination exists not just through the intellect, but it exists in reality. Auriol leaves no room for you to imagine that prime matter does not have extramental existence. It's not nothing, and it's not just a fabrication of the intellect either. It exists out there. But what a strange reality it is. Prime matter is incomplete or indeterminate, needing for its determination substantial form, and unable to exist in actuality without substantial form. To give us some way of understanding prime matter's totally pliable and plastic nature, Auriol uses one of Aristotle's favorite analogies, the bronze and the statue. But he substitutes his own terminology in what I find to be a helpful way. This is 27 on your handout. Bronze, which is indeterminately all shapes, is related to shapes in this way, for it is a certain indeterminate and indistinct entity in the genus of shape, and yet it is draggable toward every shaped being. Thus, when I shape bronze, all I'm doing is dragging it to the shaped being in actuality and distinctly. The bronze is completely indeterminate, which is to say that it's completely formable, able to take on any shape whatsoever. First is Winston Churchill, then is Joni Mitchell, and at last it finds its true usefulness as Michael Jackson. The bronze is there, but it is each of those shapes, each of those figures, drawn or dragged by the sculptor to whatever particular shape it's in. And note that in itself, qua shapeable, the bronze has no actuality that is not determinate. There is no determinateness or definition, but rather it gains actuality only through being under one shape or another. It's bronze as shaped that's actual, not the bronze with no shape. Bronze like that doesn't exist. Now, that's exactly how it is with prime matter, only writ large. Completing his analogy, Auriol writes, this is 28 on your handout, therefore, what is indeterminately everything able to be generated and corrupted, draggable to every generable and corruptible being, that's the concept of prime matter. Thus, if you want to understand the nature of matter, thinking about something purely indeterminate that becomes determinate upon the arrival of its termination, such that it is a kind of starting point, an incoatio, of every generable and corruptible entity, end quote. Prime matter is just that item that is ready to be any material thing. It's got its own nature and reality and existence, but it's got no actuality because it cannot exist separately from its substantial form, which drags the matter to being the type of thing that it is, determining it, actualizing it. For Auriol, things that can't metaphysically stand on their own, on their own 2 feet, are not separate or determinate enough to be actual. That's the definition of actuality that he's operating with. Thus, prime matter cannot exist without substantial form, telling it what it must exist as. And prime matter is pure potency precisely because it's totally unable to exist separately from substantial form. In another sense, it's also pure potency because it's the starting point of every substantial being. It can take on any substantial form because it become any type of material substance. Now, before I go on to give you just one argument and reason for Auriol's view of this ontology of prime matter, I want to briefly go back to Aquinas, because the material we've just seen is what I'm referring to when I titled this paper, Making Aquinas Make Sense. Far more prominently than I've ever seen in Aquinas, Auriol makes explicit what he means when he talks about prime matter's pure potency, or prime matter's lack of actuality. What's the actuality that we're talking about here? Auriol gives an answer: the kind of actuality involved with something that cannot exist on its own. Prime matter can in no way or sense exist on its own separately. It always needs substantial form in order to exist, and that's why it's a pure potency, possessing no actuality. In this way, Auriol makes clearer than Aquinas did, I think, about the way in which the actuality that is relevant to the discussion of prime matter, you could say, intersects with existence. When someone says correctly in Auriol's view that prime matter always needs form in order to exist, that does not in any way mean that prime matter does not exist in its own right. for Auriol. Prime matter for Auriol lacks all actuality, it's pure potency, and prime matter can never exist apart from a form, and yet Auriol is absolutely clear prime matter has its own existence and reality. Otherwise, prime matter would be nothing, absolutely nothing. And Auriol tells us, as we've seen time and again, that that can't be the case, simply because to be able to be actualized, something has to be existent. So for Auriol, lack of actuality does not entail lack of existence. They're not convertible. Here, I think that in the broadest lines, Auriol is saying loud and clear what Jeff Brouwer would take Aquinas to have been saying, but maybe didn't say so explicitly in the sense that Aquinas's theory left a lot of room, or a little bit of room, for interpretation. In the time remaining, I want to just look at one argument that Auriol gives for his view that prime matter and substantial form must both be what he calls imprecise realities. That is, they're not realities that you ever find separated from one another, but always together, the indeterminate prime matter being dragged to the substantial existence determined by the substantial form. The example I want to give is a type of modified argument from change that we saw Jeff Brouwer use with Aquinas. If matter were to have its own actuality different from forms, its own definition and distinctness and precision, then it seems to Auriol that the form would, so to speak, sit on top of matter like a thin veneer. And yet substantial change cannot be skin deep, but rather it goes all the way down, with both form and matter, each in their own way, completed by the other, since indeed neither can exist without the other. Auriol expresses this all the way down notion of substantial change with a beautiful turn of phrase. This is 29 on your handout, saying that if matter had its own actuality and determinateness, then in what we think of as episodes of substantial change, I quote, prime matter would not in itself be changed, but there would only be exchange, because another reality would be added to it. And that's what alteration is. Auriol is saying that if matter had its own actuality, defined as he does, had its own determination or ability to stand on its own, then one substantial form would leave and another would arrive, and the underlying matter would remain untouched, and it would be a skin-deep alteration, like a change of accidental color or shape. That's not how substantial change is for Auriol. For him, prime matter becomes something else in substantial change. The wine, matter and form, becomes vinegar. This is not to deny that matter has existence or being of its own. It does, since it's not nothing and actualizable, but it has no actuality, no determination that would get in the way of its becoming whatever it is determined by form to become. In fact, Auriol says this explicitly. This is 30 on your handout, which we saw in context in 22. With the arrival of the form of a stone, which is nothing other than the termination of the stone, this prime matter becomes the stone. Prime matter just is that item in existence that's able to be whatever substantial form tells it to be. This is what the nature of substantial change tells us prime matter must be. I'm going to conclude by coming back to and clarifying my overall point that Auriol was making Aquinas make sense. First, and to repeat my point from the beginning of the paper, when I say that Auriol is making sense of Aquinas, I'm not trying to make any solid historical claim about Auriol's having read and reacted to Aquinas. But my more important clarification is this. When I say that, by carefully defining what he means by actuality and its intersection with existence, Auriol makes Aquinas' theory make sense. That's not really meant as a criticism of Aquinas. When he came to write about his own hylomorphism, Auriol could and did draw on 50 years of debate and analysis of Aquinas' doctrine and a more general hylomorphic discussion that we saw in Sylvia's paper. During those 50 years, precisely one of the issues that became a major point in the hylomorphic discussion was in what way the actuality or potentiality of prime matter could be discussed most exactly And here I think, among others, of the discussion most often linked to John Duns Scotus of objective potency versus subjective potency, and how those two types of potency were attributable to prime matter. Given Auriol's familiarity with the debate on prime matter's potency since Aquinas, given his intuitions that led him to a theory like Aquinas's, of course, Auriol could see just where he needed to be more precise in defining the actuality of prime matter. That statement just says that Aquinas couldn't think of everything the first time through. Thank you very much.